I'm very excited that we have Shohei Shigematsu, the architect, who is the senior design partner of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in New York, who was in charge of the design for this project, and Allan Schwartzman of Sotheby's, who really has been, along with his colleague Karen Sutton, the manager, rabbi, inspiration, and just about everything else for this project, I think. Let me begin by asking a question of both of you, actually. I mean, this is not an easy building. It's an old industrial building that, at the time this project began, had lost a lot of its old industrial quality, so it didn't even have any kind of Dumbo or downtown cool to it. And it had been kind of made over into a quasi-corporate building, but with all due respect, not super successfully. So how did you deal with that? I mean, what did you feel you had here?
So originally, the company thought that we would move to Midtown.
Right.
We thought that we were kind of in the wrong location and needed to be in another part of town. We had reached out to a number of architects to consider working with. We had found a space. We had narrowed our search down to 3 architects, each of whom had a general concept for the space we were seeking to move into. And the day before the board meeting that came in that season, Tad asked each of the 3 finalists to do a quick sketch of how they might imagine redoing this building if we chose to stay. And he may say otherwise, but I had read it as Tad's way of proving to the board that we had to move. And in the process, the architects showed us why it is that we had to stay. And Shohei in particular, in showing us what was so great about the original building that had become buried under layers and layers of partitioning and focusing not on the floor plates, but on the interstitial spaces that rise up through it.
Right.
Yeah, well...
Shohei, please, just pick up from that.
Well, we were lucky enough to be involved in the period that the Sotheby's was searching for another location, and we could be very playful in actually pitching that this building has a potential, and I think that contributed for us to be able to convince them. But also, I'm more convinced now that the West Side, you have layer of spectacles and spectacle museum in the spectacle development. Here
I can't imagine what development you're referring to.
Here, it's like a very banal, very New York, unpretentious environment with a special building. And I think that's more New York than spectacle over spectacle. And I get more convinced by looking at the West Side now.
It was never part of this plan then to create a large structure of metal with a lot of stairways in it. Right.
It's not so shiny.
Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, one of the things that has so impressed me about this project is the way in which you've struck a balance between bringing back a certain amount of the industrial beginnings of this building, which have much more positive associations for us today than I think they did when Sotheby's first moved here. And the goal was to kind of cover them up and try to pretend it didn't have that past. Now we're sort of happy with that past, and yet at the same time, it doesn't necessarily create the most perfect environment in which to show a Monet or a Cézanne or certain other pieces, say, from before the mid-20th century. How did you kind of navigate between those things?
I think there are 2 things that contributed to really unlock this building. One is about visiting London, which the institution's origin is in London, and there is always some kind of dichotomy between the identity of London and also in New York. And I think the fact that the industrialness of this building was hidden was due to the fact that it's the stark contrast to the very historical environment that London had. But I think our discussion with Allan and Karen Everyone actually led us to believe that the contrast is actually good, and also bigness is actually good. And I think that London actually uses the space very efficiently in a historical structure, but here it had an abundance of space, which is a big potential. And I think that was the key moment that we realized that we should embrace the historical or the history of this industrial, rather kind of generic building.
Right, because I think if you had tried to make it more like Sotheby's in London, I think you would have failed anyway, right? I mean, this building would resist that profoundly, I think. Allan?
I would also add that one of the issues that we had always seen as a limitation is the fact that this building has columns every 20 feet in both directions. And I think part of the brilliance of Shohei's design is that where it serves us, the columns are embedded into the walls that have been created, and those walls have enabled us to create rooms rather than spaces. And that in the instances where the columns are exposed, they become a central feature of the architecture. Right. And indeed, they define certain rooms in a very special way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the columns are actually celebrated in in the high galleries in particular. I mean, I'm also amazed by the extent to which you have coaxed out of this building real architecture, in a way, actually, with an extraordinary variety of spaces. Did you feel more motivated by the desire to accommodate to different kinds of art, or by the desire to make different kinds of architectural experiences?
I think it's somewhere in between. For us, it was really representing their diversity of artwork that they have to deal with, but also diverse activity that they have been conducting, which is not really well communicated, in my opinion, that it's no longer a pure auction house, but it's like a multifaceted art entity. And I think that the diversity of spaces actually represents their operational and the commercial ambition of the fast turnover, and also diversity of artwork and diversity of generations or the demography that they have to deal with. And I think it really tried to communicate, and their kind of curatorial activity of daily curatorial activities basically communicated through the diversity of the space.
This building in its former incarnation was, I think its one virtue was flexibility, but it didn't necessarily have that much else other than a lot of flexibility to it. You're giving up a certain amount of flexibility now, I think, in this renovation, but getting a lot in exchange for it in terms of actual quality of spaces.
I think that in the museum building boom that we've had from the 60s onward, especially in the 70s and 80s, the mantra was flexibility. Right. The idea was that you should be able to have the option to accommodate any kind of work or any kind of exhibition, and therefore have a space that was forever could be reconfigured for each exhibition. Indeed, the Whitney Museum was built on that concept, and I think at a certain point, the Whitney, whether it was for budgetary reasons or others, did not allow the space to be readapted all the time and got locked into certain kinds of spaces. And so what we sought was a combination of spaces that would not be positioned according to a hierarchy of floors, but that you would always have a flow of small, medium, and large spaces, because indeed there is a great range of scales of works in many sales. Even in a contemporary sale, where there are many large-scale paintings, there are also many that are more intimate and have other needs.
We can see that right now.
Yeah.
There, sure.
And so the real desire was to create a network of rooms, and rooms that felt great.
The very use of the word rooms, I think, already itself shows how much you wanted to go beyond a particular way of looking at the display of art that had characterized, I think you're right, had characterized museums as well as this building for a long time. I mean, I've always felt that the more flexible a space is, the less ideal it's going to be for anything.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And you now have spaces that are really extraordinary for contemporary art, spaces that are extraordinary for smaller scale pieces, spaces that are extraordinary for sculpture and so forth, really.
Often the collector has their art in a more domestic environment, and I think the notion of intimacy to art is often lost in a kind of big flexible space. Here, I think through Allan's experience on dealing with many art collectors and the space that they actually exhibit art, I think they had a conviction that it's not necessarily about tall ceiling or flexibility of like open genericity, but it's about the diversity and the intimacy that really gives ultimately a kind of sense of flexibility or operational flexibility for them.
I mean, I'm struck by, the spaces in this building before this renovation were really quite generic at best, actually. And there feels to be nothing generic about, there really now is a sense of identity to these spaces that comes partly from getting closer to the industrial origins, but there's also a lot of refinement to those wooden portals, say, into the galleries. And for me, the juxtaposition of those two things is itself gives this identity, really, in a wonderful way.
Yeah, there was also like Allan and Karen's initiative to bring us to London and really realize the nice details and like all detail molding of London. And we actually conceived the wooden portals looking at London. Of course, it's not a literal adaptation.
You would not do literal mimicking anyway.
But we actually looked at the kind of warm feel of London and also the color of wood and so on to bring, so that we thought there's a kind of implied connection by using the wooden portals.
Sure. We also, I think,
yes,
responded to the fact that in London there are certain spaces that are quite eccentric in shape and unique. And so we wanted to build into these galleries while having a very clear kind of syntax of 20-foot square rooms, 20 by 40-foot square rooms, 40 by 60-foot square rooms. We also wanted to add to that a few uniquely scaled and shaped rooms so that they would have a sense of destination to them.
Like the octagonal room on the fourth floor.
Yes.
Right.
And there's a 20 by 60-foot gallery on the third floor, which took its inspiration from the entry gallery on the second floor in London, although on a larger scale. And then, of course, there's the grand gallery that runs almost the full width of the building on 150 feet from north to south.
Which really is an extraordinary, I mean, that's a space worthy, I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying it's a space worthy of a major museum, actually. And coaxes out of this building, almost in spite of itself, a kind of real architectural presence that I have to say, I didn't really even believe this building had in it somehow, actually, which is...
Well, I think I gave a couple of tours past week, but a lot of people said, oh, now it's going to become like a museum. But I actually always say it's really not like that. And I really got convinced looking at the density of this artwork that were displayed now. It's really not a gallery, not a museum. It's really Sotheby's. It really represents the specificity of this institution. The space, how the space actually corresponds to their, business aspect.
You've done a number of museums, so particularly in the last few years. I know you're now working on the Albright Knox in Buffalo. You've done a major museum in Quebec and others. How did that work, as well as other things you've observed in contemporary museums, impact on your work here?
I don't think there was a direct impact, but for me, dealing with art world in general is to really understand that the art world is actually quite diverse. It's not about just museum or gallery. It's about art fairs, also auction house. Also, I did collaboration with artists. I did design exhibition. So by doing everything, I think it informed also other things. So it's not about doing the museum informing this, but other efforts that we have been trying to understand the art world as a holistic thing. That I think really helped us to conceive. But of course, without their kind of support, it was not possible to really come up with this level of diversity.
How much did, I mean, you both alluded to the way in which Sotheby's is evolving as a business and broadening the nature of its business. How did that impact on the design here?
I think we saw two critical things in the redesign. One is to create great spaces for the art the whole range of art and luxury goods that are sold at Sotheby's, but also to have a facility that could accommodate other kinds of activities that enable us to broaden the range of what we do and the kinds of programs that can take place here, but also to adapt to a future of a business that we don't know entirely how this will evolve.
Is that why there was a decision made not to incorporate a formal, dedicated hall for a sales room?
Well, we continue to use this
floor.
floor.
We continue to use this floor and this space.
Yes.
Yeah.
And several of the galleries on the floors have been outfitted so that they can accommodate sales as well, ranging from a few dozen people in the audience to several hundred.
And you are looking forward to experimenting with those.
We want to play with everything.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. I mean, you now have an extraordinary new toy here, really to play with. How does the digital revolution impact on this? I mean, it is of course changing the nature of art, but also the nature of how art is displayed and sold and how people interact with it and so forth. I know that in some of the early schemes, there was a great deal of digital presence here. Is that something that you still want to do?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just at the beginning
Right.
of a number of initiatives that expand the company in a number of ways in the digital realm, whether it's bidding on major works at evening sales or online sales or instant buy it now, and other kinds of initiatives that can broaden beyond auction how we function.
Right. And Shohei, I know you've done a lot of retail work as well as museums. And in fact, I know you're working on the redesign of Tiffany right now, which is a job that I think came to you in part because of this. Has your retail experience impacted on how you've looked at Sotheby's at all?
Well, I think
a lot of consciousness of how you move through space here.
I think the one thing to learn from retail design is that how design is merged with the philosophy of the brand. Not really about the detailing or the materiality. It's about how you actually align your narrative of the space to the brand. Right. And I think that's something that is always, quite, sharp. You have to be very sharp in a retail design. So I think that may be informed here. But of course, a lot of board members here also has the retail business. So we were actually kind of told or taught how to actually bring that kind of mentality to this design too, which was quite useful for us.
How much real structural change did you do to the building? Because it looks and feels so different.
We made 3 double height spaces. So those areas, we took out the floors. That's why the columns are relatively larger, fatter, because we had to reinforce the column.
You really remade those columns, right? Those are not truly artifacts. Right.
But one issue that Tad told us was he told us to fix the plane while it's flying. He used that analogy of fix the plane while it's flying. I mean, we were like kind of. I thought he was joking in the beginning, but actually he was serious. So we very carefully conceal the areas that we are renovating, and also structural work had to happen, of course, not during the work hours, but also in a very discrete moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was also one of the challenges that this project had. And we were also joking that some actually employees don't even know that the renovation is happening. That's how careful we were.
I wish you'd been in charge of the renovation of LaGuardia Airport then, actually. It might have worked a little bit better. I think one of the things related to that, though, is which we haven't talked about, is how much more rational and intuitive the circulation and the movement through the building now is. And it used to be that the public spaces and display spaces were sort of scattered around. Now, pretty much, with the exception of the gallery that remains for the moment, at least on the 10th floor, the upper floors are mostly internal offices and administration and storage, and the lower floors are public exhibition. So there's a much more logical sense to it and a more logical way to move around it, I think.
Which is part of this idea of making visible the history of the building.
Right.
I mean, the fact that we have floor plates that are so large, but that was never really exhibited in the galleries themselves. Right. It was a huge shift.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable because it really is doing two things that almost contradict each other, which is that it kind of connects more to the industrial history of the building, and yet at the same time it's much more refined. Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking Allan and Shohei. Thank you.